Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going on a really fascinating journey to uncover the gritty, survival-based origins of human knowledge. We often think of science as this modern invention, but we're going to completely flip that idea on its head. We'll be looking at this through the lens of Abdelazim Anis's incredible book, Science and Civilization. And as you'll see, the earliest scientific breakthroughs weren't made by guys in white lab coats, but by our ancient ancestors fighting tooth and nail just to stay alive. So, did science actually exist before civilization? It's a great question, isn't it? Hooking right into our main theme, we have to challenge a very common misconception, the idea that science requires modern laboratories, complex equations, or classical philosophers walking around in togas. What if I told you that the actual foundations of science were laid tens of thousands of years before the very first city was ever built? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our chronological time travel roadmap. First, we'll cover the myth of pure science, followed by Stone Age fire, the agricultural revolution, the Bronze Age state, and finally, numbers and stars. Starting with Section 1, the myth of pure science and why we need to bust the Greek miracle. And this brilliantly illustrates how the Greek miracle is largely a historical myth. Don't get me wrong, classical Greek thinkers were absolutely brilliant, but they definitely didn't invent science out of thin air. They actually inherited an enormous wealth of practical and technical knowledge from much, much older civilizations in the ancient river valleys of the Nile, the Euphrates, and the Indus. Science started way earlier. I absolutely love this quote by historian Benjamin Farrington. He says that science arises through contact with things, that its true source is experience, and its ultimate test is practical success. I mean, that perfectly captures the reality of ancient history. Science was born not from abstract pondering in some quiet room, but from the urgent, dirty, everyday economic and survival needs of early humanity. Which brings us to Section 2, Stone Age survival and fire, or as I like to call them, our first chemists. Looking at this visual roadmap of historical eras, from the Paleolithic around 10,000 BC through the Neolithic all the way to the Bronze and Iron Ages, it's wild to think they are literally defined by the dominant tools and materials of their time, as observed by historians like J.D. Bernal and Gordon Childe. The evolution of human history is, at its core, the evolution of our tools. In that earliest, harshest era, the most monumental breakthrough was, without a doubt, the discovery of fire. Now, this wasn't just a neat trick to stay warm. It was humanity's very first major foray into applied chemistry, way before safety goggles were a thing. It fundamentally altered our existence. It allowed us to cook food, survive freezing climates, and properly skin animals to make clothing. Crucially, huddling around that fire created the very first social, matriarchal clan structures, sometimes known as totemic tribes. Fire literally built our first societies. But what happened when early humans faced challenges that their primitive tools just couldn't fix? When they couldn't guarantee a successful hunt or predict the rain, they turned to what historians call sympathetic magic. They used rituals and dances as a desperate attempt to control an incredibly terrifying natural world. It wasn't merely superstition, you see. It was a primitive, early form of science, an attempt to find a mechanism to survive when their technical knowledge fell short. Let's move into Section 3. The agricultural revolution. Villages and high temperatures. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast. We jump from the nomadic hunting and gathering of the Paleolithic directly into the Neolithic agricultural revolution. Suddenly, we are seeing permanent settlements, the farming of grains, and the domestication of animals. It's a total ground-up revolution in human socioeconomic existence. And, as you'd guess, with settling down came entirely new domestic needs. To store their grain, they needed pottery. To eat that grain, they needed bread. This basic need led straight to the invention of high-temperature ovens. Without even realizing it, just by trying to feed themselves and store their harvest, these newly settled villagers accidentally birthed complex thermal engineering and applied thermal science. On to Section 4, the Bronze Age and the State, where we start administering the surplus. This creates such a brilliant cause and effect chain. Better farming creates an agricultural surplus. Suddenly, you have enough food that not everyone has to be out in the fields farming all day, which creates a non-farming ruling class of priests and kings. But here's the catch. This new wealth and land requires management. And to administer it, the state literally forces the invention of writing and arithmetic. Math didn't come from philosophers gazing at the sky, it came from accountants desperately trying to track cows and grain. This dynamic created the first major class division in human history. The working class was tied down to manual labor, physical craftsmanship, and farming. Meanwhile, the ruling class was completely freed from that manual labor. And it was this free time that allowed the elite to write down, formalize, and study what became known as the noble sciences, things like advanced abstract math and astronomy. Wrapping up our journey with Section 5, Needs Drive Numbers and Stars. It's all about practical problem solving. So the crucial point is that none of these abstract sciences were invented just for fun. Fractions, they were invented because boat builders needed absolutely exact measurements for their timber. Astronomy wasn't just romantic stargazing, it was required to build a solar calendar so farmers could predict the flooding of the Nile. And geometry? It was a direct socioeconomic requirement for calculating land borders after those floods, and for engineering massive structures like the pyramids. Abstract science is directly, literally linked to gritty physical labor. Taking a look back at our sourcebook, Science and Civilization by Abdel Azim Anis, he highlights a stunning example of this, the Egyptian invention of the 365-day solar calendar. This incredible feat of science was purely an economic necessity. The old lunar calendar just wasn't accurate enough for agriculture. They needed to predict the Nile's floods with absolute pinpoint precision to prevent mass starvation. To do this, they looked to the heavens. They figured out that the stars Sirius perfectly aligned with the start of the Egyptian agricultural year. Again, they weren't studying the stars for astrology. They were using the sky as a giant cosmic clock to guarantee their harvest and keep their society alive. Let's move to and see how this builds. Because of their precise observations of the stars for farming, the ancient Egyptians gave us the 365 days solar calendar. It is a direct descendant of those ancient survival tactics. It was refined later by Julius Caesar and Pope Gregory, sure, but it is the exact same calendar you and I still use today. Mind-blowing, right? But honestly, none of this knowledge would have survived without one key invention. As historian Gordon Childe notes, the invention of writing allowed man to immortalize his experience and transfer it directly to his contemporaries who live far from him and to generations not yet born. Recording these survival techniques, the math, the astronomy, the agriculture, that was the true revolution that built our modern world. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to wrap up this explainer. We've seen clearly that ancient science didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was intensely driven by raw survival, by agriculture, and by the economic needs of the ruling class to manage their wealth. So looking at our own era, we have to ask ourselves, what hidden economic forces and survival needs are driving the massive scientific discoveries of today? It's definitely something to think about next time you look at a brand new piece of technology. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the world around you.